Good morning. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jason Worlledge. I'm the Regional Program Director for the International Republican Institute based in Warsaw, Poland. It's really great to be here in person. It's really great to be at the Budapest Forum in person, and I'm really like to congratulate the organizers for being able to make this happen. Our panel today aims to explore the Chinese Communist Party's strategies of subnational influence in the role of local level politics and local level elected officials in the global competition of systems and values. We're also going to look to our panelists here to describe the threats and risks that we see on a local level and CCP engagement, and also hopefully hear some different policy solutions today. We're running a little bit behind schedule, so I'm going to quickly get out of the way and allow our panelists to take over. But please join me in welcoming four great experts on this, practitioners and politicians who have spent large parts of their career working on this issue. To my left, Dr. Rumena Filipova from Bulgaria. She is a research fellow at the Center for the Study of Democracy in Bulgaria. Next to her, Mayor Hřib, who is the mayor of the beautiful city of Prague. If you have not visited, I highly encourage it. Thank you for being here with us today, Mayor. Didi Kirsten Tatlow is a senior fellow at the Asia program at the German Council for Foreign Relations, and also a non-resident fellow at Project Synopsis based in Prague, and author of a recent study, Beyond Espionage, which I'm sure will come up today in our conversations, and a fine gentleman from IRI, Matt Schrader, who's recently joined IRI and is the author of Friends and Enemies, another publication which I highly encourage everyone to look at as it, once again? Yes. So, Mayor Hřib, I think it'd be nice to start with you and hear your perspective. You have a very personal story when it comes to this topic, and you've played a very central role in Czech Republic in resetting the agenda and building positive relations with Taipei. And as a result of this, you've become involved in a quite public diplomatic spat. And if I understand, as a result of this, you've had to actually take on increased security protection in your hometown of Prague. And could you walk us through how we end up here today? What was it that triggered this?
Well, it's quite a long story now, but I will try to keep it short. So, sorry. Okay, so I said it's quite a long story, but I will try to keep that really short. Well, it originally started with the fact that somehow Prague, during the previous term, was dragged into the international politics, actually. And this has been done by adding this article number 3 in the Beijing and Prague partnership or sister cities agreement. And this article was talking about one China policy. And according to our view, the new coalition that was formed in 2018, such an article has no place in the partnership agreement between two municipalities, because it's simply a thing for the national government, and actually I was not very happy with that either. So we tried to negotiate that. So we asked the Beijing administration to start the talks about leaving that out. And that started a chain of events when they started to bully our orchestras, which were actually not ours as a city, but they had the Prague in their name. So they started to cancel their already arranged tours. They were sending us some messages over the media, and in the end they started to ignore us. That was at the point when we said that nor London nor Riga has got this article number 3 in their partnership agreements with Beijing. So after that we had found in a position that we've got a partner who is actually not willing to talk with us. So we decided to cancel the contract, but as this is a two-level process in our city, it has to be agreed, it has to be approved on the level of the city council and then on the level of the city assembly. So actually the Beijing canceled the agreement from their side in between this. So formally they have cancelled the contract in the end. So, if I should summarize this somehow, what we wanted was basically to have a partnership agreement that would be based on a mutual respect, a partnership agreement that would be mutually beneficial for both sides, which was not the case in the partnership between Beijing and Prague, because all the projects were done solely for the benefit of the Beijing side, and actually it was all managed as a sponsorship gift from one guy, the richest Czech, by the way, to support his business in China. And the last thing we want was actually we would like to have apolitical partnerships, partnerships with other cities. So that's what we wanted, and well, we ended with a lot of threats from China, which in the end turned actually not to be that much of a problem. But I understand that if anyone else would be in our position, they would have to face this challenge. That means that there will be either threats from the Chinese side, there will be local opposition telling that it will have a huge economical impact, which was not the case actually in our case, because the Chinese business size is actually a little bit overrated in our case. In case of Czech Republic, and I believe it's quite similar in the whole V4. And the last thing is that actually the Chinese, not actually the Chinese side, it was this home credit company who actually created, because they had these business interests in China, and they have actually paid a sort of media agency to create a network of politicians and journalists and I would say pseudo-academical people to support their view of China as a partner, as a meaningful partner. And but if you look at the numbers, it's completely the opposite, completely the opposite way. The Czech export to China is actually stagnating for quite a long time, and these visits from the Czech president to China had actually no real positive impact on that. So that's why I'm saying that China's influence is, if you go to raw numbers, it's overrated.
You mentioned threats. Can we speak specifically to some of these?
Well, it's it's about like Prague is, for example, a very touristic destination. That means that if you are saying something against China, there will be voices saying that there will be less Chinese tourists because somehow the People's Republic of China will cut the influx of tourists from China to Czech Republic. That means mainly to Prague, because Prague is, or was at least, around half of the foreign tourist exchange in Czech Republic. So that means there will be voices saying that you're actually damaging Czech Republic in an economic way. And that is definitely something what you can build upon in a political way, as a political topic. Someone is damaging the economic interest of Czech people, basically. The fact is that actually Prague has got or had a huge problem with over-tourism before COVID, so it's actually not exactly a problem. If we would lost all in 2019, the numbers were showing us that if we would lost all the Chinese tourists, which would probably not happen, we would actually fall like 2 years back, and it was still over-touristed in Prague. But this has got many reasons, and it's a completely separate topic, the over-tourism issue. So I would like not to dig too much into this.
Well, so what kind of conversations are you then having with your colleague mayors in the rest of Czech Republic? or in the Visegrad region. So what are they saying as a result of your experience, and are you finding the type of support, you know, on the international stage that you need?
Well, yes, we had a lot of support from the international community, and I think that actually the important thing was the fact that we had inspired with what we have done, and that means we have turned, we have stand on our values, and we have not changed our mind, although there was this pressure that was being paid by this home credit company and so on, and also from the local national politicians in Czech Republic, for example, our president and so on. So we had not diverted from our way. And we had, for example, upgraded our partnership agreement with Taipei that we had since 2001, but was a little bit sort of suspended. We were not doing a lot of projects with them, but we had upgraded it to the level of the sister cities agreement, and now we're doing a lot of projects in, for example, the climate agenda, circular economy, innovations, students exchange, and so on. So this relationship proved to be much more beneficial for both sides than it was in the case of Beijing and Prague partnership. And it's also about the context, because Beijing is a megapolis, much more bigger than Prague. And of course, Taipei is still bigger than Prague, but it's still at least like measurable. It's just twice as big, and it's operating in a democratic context of a democratic country. Therefore, the solutions are transferable from one city to another, which is definitely not possible in case of Beijing. From Beijing to Prague, it's not. It's simply not possible. And we have inspired others by this. So there was this trip of the chairman of the Senate President Miloš Vystrčil to Taiwan, and you can see the difference how the municipal politics could start the change. Because when we went to Taipei and we had met the president Tsai Ing-wen, it was a trip of our Prague party's politicians. It was a single party, single city trip, to say so. But just a few months after that, this journey of the president of the Senate, Miloš Vystrčil, there was many other senators from different parties, and they had constituencies all around the country. So I really hope that this will inspire other countries on the European level.
Excellent, thank you. Didi, you've been looking at this, and researching this issue in Germany. Can you help us understand what is the CCP strategy when it comes to subnational engagement?
Right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very, very much. It's really interesting to hear Mayor Hřib talk about the experience of Prague, because it really all begins, well, a lot of it begins in Europe, including in Germany, for example, with this concept of sister cities, which sounds so innocent and nice, and no doubt brings some rewards for some people as well. But in fact, when you start to examine what this concept is for the Chinese side, it very quickly becomes clear that it's a concept that is sort of instrumentalized in many ways in order to achieve certain goals in the fellow city in Europe, be it in Germany, be it Helsinki, be it Cologne, be it Prague, as the mayor was explaining. And the reason for this is that the sister city relationships are in large part run by a particular organization in Beijing called the CPAFFC, which stands for the Chinese People's Association for Friendship with Foreign Countries. One has to get the acronyms right, dealing with Chinese politics, a lot of very long acronyms. And this organization was set up in 1954 for For those who have some either direct memory of Eastern European times or passed down through parents perhaps, they will understand that from the Russian, from the Soviet era, as the druzhba system, I think is the word in Russian. Correct me if that's not the right pronunciation or word. And in essence, it seeks to reach into organizations, places, people's political structures on the grassroots level. So we're talking not exactly grassroots, but subnational for sure, city level, municipal level, and to set up the type of relationships that enable all kinds of other things to happen that the target may not be aware of. And there's, if I can give one concrete example from Germany, when I began to research this in Germany, a very nice music association in the city of Mainz, down in the southwest of Germany, was out of the blue contacted by the CPA-FFC from Beijing. At the time it was headed, I believe, by Li Xiaolin, and said, wouldn't you like to host a pipa, a Chinese traditional music event? And they said, yeah, sure, because this music association was a very high-level established classical music association in Germany, where classical music is highly valued, in fact. And so they did that. But what they didn't understand was that they were essentially had been targeted as a great way to begin to build a network throughout Germany, and this happened, which, when I wrote about it, consisted of 36 friendship associations in Germany and one Chinese partner. And essentially it began with music, and before they knew it, the German sides from all cities around the place or smaller towns were being invited to artificial intelligence meetings and production forums in Beijing, and just all kinds of really high-tech sort of business stuff. And clearly it had gone very far from the original beginnings in a nice musical cultural encounter. And after I reported on this situation, in fact the website of the German organization was completely overhauled. A lot of information was taken down. Luckily we had saved some of it. And even more tellingly, in German, the title is the Arbeitsgemeinschaft Deutscher China Gesellschaften. So the German association, work association of China associations or something like this. But in Chinese, the title of this umbrella organization in Germany is the German-Chinese Friendship Association. So there we have the word friendship. It only appears in Chinese. This is, in my opinion, a deliberate mistranslation in order to make Germany feel that they are not, that these associations were not being co-opted by a highly political organization in Beijing, when in fact they were. And that brings us back to the sister city issue, because in fact, the CPA-FFC, as I said, has this obligation to build sister city relationships around the world, and it has, I think, it has dozens and dozens, scores of associations with Germany, with Egypt, with with regions, etc. Maybe 50 from memory, something like this. But I found a notice from the CPA-FFC to the German umbrella organization saying that since you are our contact in Germany into politics, both at the local and the national level, an unofficial contact clearly, we expect you to do more to establish other sister city relationships within Germany. You have not been performing, was essentially the message in pretty much as many words. So this is quite an unusual sort of reprimand.
Well, was there a threat attached to it as well? I mean, normally when you say you're not performing, there's always perform or else. So was there an or else?
There wasn't an or else that was spelled out in writing, no. But that notice as well disappeared from the website after I published something about this with Synopsis, the research organization in Prague that does really excellent China CCP research. So, that's one thing. And something that I've also noticed then is that these sister city relationships, many of them in Germany are quite old. They date back to approximately 1985, for example, between Hamburg and Shanghai. This is now leading to massive trade and de facto Belt and Road Initiative activity in Hamburg. the two port cities then. Costco wants to buy part of the port of Hamburg. It was rejected from Trieste in Italy, and then went to Hamburg, and it could be that the intention, it's been reported in Germany, is to find a back door into the port of Trieste through the ownership, because HHLA, the Hamburg Port Authority, owns quite a bit of Trieste port as well. So if Costco goes into Hamburg, then Hamburg can get back into Trieste. Then Costco can get back into Trieste, even though they were already rejected eventually. So you see how the networks kind of work like that, and then they spread. And a final point about sort of sister city relationships, if I may, because there's really far too much to say about. It's a fascinating topic. So I have noticed that some of the oldest established relationships, for example, Cologne and Beijing, or Helsinki and Beijing, very often you look through what they have in terms of personnel, and you see that suddenly there's somebody who's a China business advisor in the office of the mayor. And this will usually be somebody who's come from China at some point or other, and is very much steering activity in a certain direction, and is quite watchful of queries from the outside about what they're doing, what are their aims, etc. And it can be directly tied to business as well. For example, I was told, my reporting showed that in Helsinki doesn't do sister city relationships, apparently. This is what I was told. But they had to form one with Beijing back in 2005, because if they didn't, the Nokia deal was off. Like, Nokia couldn't produce in China. So there again, you see the political use and how it's tied to business.
I mean, in essence, we're playing two different games. You have municipalities in Europe and other places around the world who are looking for opportunities to engage in international business and trade, while on the other side, the partners are playing a game of serious geopolitics. And from our work, throughout the 1990s and 2000s with local elected officials, it's always been challenging to get them to look at engagement through the lens of geopolitics. So how do we communicate, and this can be a question for both you, Mayor, and Didi, how do we communicate to these local elected officials the risk, and how do we help them analyze and assess the risk when they're engaging in something seemingly innocuous like a sister city agreement? Mayor, if you'd like to.
Okay, well, the risks are pretty obvious. Maybe specifically in the area of electronic devices. I mean, with the advancement of, for example, 5G networks and so on. There was one of the things that actually had influence on our case with the Prague and Beijing was this warning issued by a National Institute for Cybernetic Security, which is a governmental agency for cybernetic security. And they had issued a warning against the products of Huawei and ZTE against actually their use in the critical networks or critical infrastructure. So we had checked our network. We haven't found actually any components like this on our critical networks. However, maybe some municipalities do not put enough attention to this topic, and I think this is one of the problems, because there were obvious attempts how to abuse these devices for the benefit of the, I would say, interests of the People's Republic of China. So that's one thing. And the second thing, seriously, is that you should not be afraid of saying no, to say so, because although there will be many threats and many paid media outputs, or how to put that, it's really good to see the real numbers and definitely stand on your values, even if there might be some mild economical loss. For example, if I look back on the delegation of Miloš Vystrčil, the president of our Senate, to Taipei, there was a lot of threats from the Chinese side, of course, a lot of economical impact, problems, and so on. And in the end, the net result was that some Chinese company cancelled their order of 11 pianos from a Czech company. In a few days, or maybe even hours, those pianos were purchased by a Czech businessman who is a sponsor of classical music events, for example, in Prague, and they were donated to schools. So seriously, you have to look realistically on these threats, and the influence of China in our region is seriously overrated.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think that's absolutely right for some countries in the EU, but Germany is unfortunately in a different situation, and it's a really tricky problem to deal with, because Germany for sure has some dependencies on China, just over 100 particular product categories. These dependencies exist. We've got, of course, the car industry, the chemical industry. The car industry in particular is deeply networked into Central Eastern European countries. This is another fascinating issue that I think we need to look at more closely. And how much money do the German car companies actually make from China is another question that could be perhaps looked at a little more closely, and what can be more can be done in the EU to replace perhaps some of this stuff. But one thing I wanted to say about the disparity in relations. You know, you have this very well-trained team from Beijing. It's an entire institution, the CPAFFC. I encourage you to look it up online. It's got an English language website. It's enormously busy. One day it's meeting somebody, you know, from a European country. The next day it's talking to the Princess of Tonga. I mean, it really does just everything. And the thing that one notices is the disparity between the local government, for example, in Germany, a Kommune, you know, a commune, that then is confronted with this team from Beijing, very high level, strategically completely briefed, enormous political power behind them, party discipline, ideology, organization above all. And, you know, the German side is just at a total loss in a sense, so without wanting to be rude or anything, but because they're simply not trained like that. They're not trained to think like that. Their system isn't like that. According to the German constitution, the localities cannot develop a foreign policy that differs from the Bund, from Berlin. This is actually not permitted. So that's an issue that's then starts to become quite complicated, how to negotiate that difference. One final point is that it's not all about the sister cities. There's all kinds of other interventions going on, some of them tied, for example, to mass diplomacy, to disguised bribery. I would say we've had some cases in Germany of Bundestag members being offered, you know, a lot of money, hundreds of thousands of euros, to sell masks in a seller's market during the pandemic. One guy had to resign his post as a result, and it turned out that although people realized that he was connected to a local German company that had been bought by a Beijing company in 2016, and this was the company that was giving him the masks to sell in this market where everybody just wanted to snap them up. So, you know, it's unclear why he needed €250,000 to do this job. What people didn't understand, because they lack expertise, and this is my point, the expertise is missing in Europe, right? The expertise at all levels is missing, but also at the communal, municipal level, also the national level, by the way, is that the Beijing company that provided him with €250,000 actually is owned or directed by the director, I think the position is called, a member of the CPPCC in Beijing, which is the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, and it is a core element of the United Front, which is an internal organization of the Communist Party tasked with connecting to external organizations within China and around the world, so i.e. to co-opt non-communist party people for the party. So there we had a very clear case of influencing, of interfering really into the German political system. It was carried out at the local level in Mannheim, in the state of Baden-Württemberg, but he was the Bundestags member of the national government for his locality.
Thank you. Let me use this as an opportunity to segue and talk about that lack of knowledge base. Like many in the audience, I am not an expert on the subject matter expert, and Matt, your publication has been very helpful, Friends and Enemies. I encourage everyone to have a look at this. Already we've heard a very challenging acronym that I'm not going to attempt to repeat right now. We also have things like the International Liaison Department and these kind of broad concepts like party-to-party diplomacy. Can you walk us through some of this, Matt? Help us raise our knowledge level from maybe a 0 to a 1 in terms of how these things function and what are the risks behind them.
Well, how much time do you have?
I would say about 10 minutes, so we
10
can
minutes?
give Dr. Filipova a chance
So
to speak
walk you
also.
through the bureaucracy of a nation of 1.3 billion people in 2 minutes?
It seems like a fair ask, yes?
Yeah,
Thank
okay. That's why I'm the expert, right? Very, 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 very high level. The important parts of the system that I think people in this position, people in municipalities, people in Europe need to know about. Didi has already mentioned one. One is the United Front Work Department. It's a department of, it's not in the government. It's not a this is something that people have trouble with outside of China, that you have the party system which actually sort of oversees and runs the government itself. So, and makes all of the real important decisions when it comes to geopolitics. So the UFWD is a portion of the Communist Party itself, whose job, as Didi has said, is basically to mobilize the rest of Chinese society, mobilize the parts of Chinese society that are not the party around the party's political objectives. And so you look at the organizational structure of the UFWD, and its sub-bureaus are named literally things like intellectuals, the business community, overseas Chinese, Hong Kong and Taiwan, minorities, religion. It's essentially a list of the portions of society that the party considers sources of potential threats, sources of potential alternative sources of power. And the job of the UFWD is to take these different cohorts of Chinese society and turn them into strengths, and turn them into ways to propagate the political agenda of the party, initially throughout Chinese society, but what has happened is as China's become more connected with the rest of the world, the work of the UFWD has naturally become more enmeshed with other societies. So we've seen it popping up everywhere, particularly in Australia, which I think we may get to that case at some point. So UFWD is one. Ministry of Foreign Affairs is another obvious one. They have primary oversight responsibility of the CPA-FFC, the Chinese People's Association for Friendship with Foreign Countries. To make things more complicated, there are other friendship societies that are primarily overseen by other parts of the party system. I think it's called the Chinese People's Association for Friendly Contact or something like that. It's mostly a military organization, actually, primarily reports to the PLA. The PLA actually does some fairly important influence and intelligence work. It has an entire military intelligence wing that does a lot of work focusing on other countries. A lot of the things we see in the United States, I think, can ultimately be traced back to PLA2, the department of the PLA that does military intelligence. And probably the last major one to refer to is the International Liaison Department, which is, again, another branch of the Communist Party. It's not a part of the government. The MFA is the only thing in all of this we're talking about that's the government. The ILD is the part of the Chinese Communist Party with primary responsibility for handling political relationships with other political parties throughout the world. So when somebody from the Czech Republic, for example, who is not in the government, who is in an opposition party, visits China, that visit, that handling, that relationship is not handled by the MFA, it's handled by the ILD. And so the people who are tasked with doing that outreach, that oversight, is the ILD. And the ILD and the Friendship Society system come out of a time when China was very isolated internationally. You know, it comes out of the 1950s when China was not in the UN, when China had to find ways to develop relationships with other countries that were not at the government-to-government level. And so there's an entire, very well-developed, very well-resourced, very professional bureaucracy in Beijing whose job is to make sure that Beijing has somebody to talk to, they have friends, they have people who can serve as a voice in important forums regardless of who is in power, or ways to have their voice or perceptions that have been influenced by them in the room. So the main ones that do that, UFWD, ILD, MFA, PLA, but ultimately the entire party state is tasked with fulfilling the political objectives of the CCP. And so PRC-SOEs, big state-owned enterprises, have important political objectives that they're expected to uphold. Now they have a lot of independence within that framework and a lot of room for figuring out how they're going to do it, and they don't always do what Beijing asks them, because it turns out sometimes people just want to make some money instead of listening to the bosses in Beijing. But yeah, it's a big, complicated system. There's a lot to know. I'm just sort of giving you the very, very tip of the iceberg here. And I think it really just kind of goes back to Didi's point about expertise, that even among the community of China experts, people who governments and other parts of society rely on around the world to advise them about China, the level of expertise about these particular bodies, I think, is not very high, which is why we've been surprised by the emergence of things like the UFWD in Australia, because we didn't know about it and we weren't looking. Just one last point, and I'll stop talking, because you've opened up a rant of mine, so I apologize for that.
You're welcome.
Yeah. The premier journal of China studies in the United States is called the China Quarterly. It's sort of the clearinghouse for the thoughts of the most eminent scholars of China in the United States, and actually also the UK, because I think it's run out of Cambridge. The one in the UK, not the one in the United States. And if you do a keyword search for United Front Work Department in the China Quarterly, going back, I think the last time I did this was a year and a half ago, and I looked back 30 years. You'll find 4 articles that mention the United Front Work Department, and all of them are about ethnic minorities or religion, and none of them are about the business community, none of them are about overseas Chinese, none of them are about Hong Kong or Taiwan. The party's been very clear that these systems matter, but the people in our system whose job it is to study China and inform us about China haven't always been looking at these. There's books that have come out in the past 2 years about how China manages society-government relations or society-party relations that don't mention the United Front Work Department in their entire text, because the academic community hasn't been looking at this. So what I'm saying is that if anybody out here wants to throw a lot of money at studies looking at this kind of stuff, please do not hesitate, because there's very frankly a great need, I think, for deeper and continued understanding of these things. And I see we have a couple of friends from Taiwan who have been nodding their heads at points in this presentation, because they know very, very well what the United Front Work Department is and what it's meant to do.
I mean, the way you describe this, it almost sounds like it's an all-of-society approach to undermine democratic institutions abroad, which is ironic, because this is also the approach that experts say we need as democratic societies to undermine this.
Well, so here is where things get very complicated and very messy. Because in an ideal world for the CCP, yes, they are able to mobilize all of Chinese society in a unified fashion towards all of their goals. If you're Xi Jinping sitting in Beijing, that's what you want. And that's why the UFWD exists. And it is an attempt to mobilize all the important sectors of Chinese society. I think when people actually interact with folks from China, what they find is that regular folks from China can frequently exist in kind of a world outside of these politics, and that they don't seem to be greatly connected to the politics of Beijing in any way. Beijing doesn't always get everything it wants. And so I think the reason you need this expertise is to, rather than have it be a discussion about everything and everyone from China is a risk everywhere and all times always, to be able to have an informed discussion about what a level of risk looks like with your counterparty. what are their specific connections back to Beijing? What institutions are they tied with? Who are they meeting with? Who owns them? What do they owe money to? Which is, in a sense, not too different from analyzing some of these political affiliations in a country here in the West. You know, money talks. Who are their partners? But we just simply don't have the expertise to do analysis with that level of sophistication. And so it's, you know, you either end up with people on one side who say it's racist even to mention this, or people on the other side who say there's reds under the bed at every corner. Not one of these things is accurate, but to be able to arrive at the truth, you need to actually know what you're talking about.
Excellent, thank you. Let us kind of turn to Dr. Filipova in Bulgaria. Matt said something very interesting, and I think I have to agree with it. A lot of people just want to make money. A lot of people want to improve their lives, and a lot of local elected officials, or I would say local elected officials in general, their job is to improve the lives of their constituents and their communities. What do we see in Bulgaria? You know, when we have this structure that incentivizes building these relationships between local communities in this region and local communities in China, do we see this here?
Yes, definitely. So we have started observing this general trend that has been charted out also in Southeast Europe and in Bulgaria and Romania more specifically. And there are a number of examples. So first of all, it's interesting that at the parliamentary level in Bulgaria, of the committees for friendship with foreign countries, those focused on China and Russia usually gather the largest number of members of parliament.
Well, why is that?
Yeah, that is a conundrum actually, because if we speak about the government level and strategy, we cannot say that there has been a clear and consistent government strategy on China or a clear economic assessment of what can be gained, but also lost from interactions with China. But we actually see that at the level of the National Assembly and MPs, there is a lot of interest. So it means that this is a potential vulnerability that China can tap into. And then another example, and especially when we talk about this question about cooperation or coordination between Russia and China in various regions in the world, but in Bulgaria more specifically, local pro-Russian actors in the media sphere, politics and business tend to act as the major enablers of Chinese influence in the country, and that is, for instance, quite visible in the media sphere. And one example of this is the recent Bulgarian language edition of China Today, which is the counterpart of the Bulgarian Russia Today. And those two news outlets have the same editorial and management body, and they're all related to Russophile circles and parties in Bulgaria. And just to draw a contrast with Serbia here, because in the Bulgarian case, the Russian actors are very much on the so-called subnational level, but in Serbia, they are on the highest political echelon. So the Chinese influence is promoted through pro-Russian actors on the highest levels of politics. So pro-government media outlets in Serbia tend to promote both Russian and Chinese propaganda, but also in terms of institutionalization, there is also a council for the coordination of cooperation between Russia and China in Serbia. So in Bulgaria, it's more subnational. In Serbia, it's more on the highest political levels. Then another example is that when Chinese business or journalist delegations visit Bulgaria, they also reach out to the regions and they build connections specifically with local journalists, for example. And then the most recent instance from the pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic, is that Chinese donations of masks took place on the interregional level. So basically, Chinese provinces donated medical equipment to provinces and towns in Bulgaria with which China had already concluded sister town agreements, as we already heard. So there are a number of local actors emerging in Bulgaria which enable Chinese influence, and there are some Chinese strategies for subnational influence in investment activities in the countries. And just to touch on the consequences of that, overall they tend to be rather negative. So when Chinese investments do materialize in Bulgaria, they usually lead to financial loss. They rarely lead to an enhancement of local industrial capacity or improvement in the labor market. So there are no increases in wages or employment, and also the influx of Chinese investments or even interest or pledges of investment raise serious issues about national security risks and vulnerabilities. And just overall, when Chinese companies do come to Bulgaria, because it is true that the overall level of influence could be more limited, they usually still take a very small entrepreneurial risk. The majority of the capital tends to be provided by their Bulgarian counterparts, and this makes it very easy for the Chinese companies to withdraw rather quickly when they do not see quick profit.
Well, the mayor said that we overestimate the course of leverage that China has. What do you think the perception is in Bulgaria? Is there a perception that there is a lot of leverage that China has over the country, or is it the opposite?
It's totally true that we underestimate the level of Chinese influence in Central and Eastern Europe, but when we speak about Bulgaria and Romania, we can say that the scope of Chinese influence through corrosive capital and the attendant governance vulnerabilities that come with it are even in a way more limited in scope. However, as you asked, there is an overarching Bulgarian perception or desire that there should be more investment coming in, and that in a way we have lost out somehow, and we're different from the regional trend, but that's on the level of perception of society. So, however, and it's interesting that the level of influence may be somewhat lower, but that doesn't necessarily always lead to an equally determined response to counter Chinese influence. And here I would just make a comparison between Bulgaria and Romania, because in Romania the political decisiveness has been much stronger. They took determined political action, for example, limiting the award of public procurement contracts, especially in the infrastructural sector, to companies that come from countries that do not have a bilateral trade agreement with the EU. And here China is in focus. They also limited the use of Huawei equipment for 5G construction, and they ceased cooperation with a Chinese company which was going to build a nuclear power plant in Romania. So we see a rather determined action in that country, but in Bulgaria it has been more muted. So in a way the country would always go along at the end of the day with the strategic framework charted out by its EU and US partners, but it has been less decisive. And I think here the issue of response has to do with the level of general political and societal resilience to foreign authoritarian states and their general levels of susceptibility, which has a lot to do also with history and cultural factors. So in a country like Romania, which has traditionally been very wary of authoritarian states, especially Russia, now it is replicating a similar response to China. But in a country like Bulgaria, which has had historical susceptibilities to foreign states, especially Russia, it is being now softer on China.
So thank you. Mindful of the time, we have about 10 minutes left, and I would like to, we've spoken at length about the threats and the risks, and I think we have a good understanding of this. I would like to talk about what we should be doing as policymakers. So, Matt, I come to you. You mentioned Australia. This is I think, a global example of this. I think this provides both examples of the risks and the possible policy solutions. Could you give us a quick rundown on this and propose anything you would like national decision makers or policymakers to look at?
So Australia, I'm always surprised at sort of how little knowledge there is of what has been happening with Australia, frankly, not just in Europe, but even in Washington, D.C. as well. People who really should know the the story of what's happened there don't. And to sort of steal the mayor's trick and tell a very complicated story as shortly as possible. Essentially what happened in Australia was they discovered that there were businessmen who were originally from China. One of them was a resident in Australia, the other had become an Australian citizen, but they were real estate billionaires, or nominally real estate billionaires. In some cases, the source of funds is unclear. Had found that these businessmen had become the largest donors, or among the largest donors, to both of Australia's major political parties. And at the time in Australia, it was not illegal for somebody who was not a citizen of Australia to donate to its political parties. And it became pretty clear that both of these men were acting as proxies for Beijing's interests in Australian politics. You know, not only were they seeking to influence the policy of Australia towards China and towards the United States and towards the Asia Pacific more broadly through these donations, they were establishing networks within Australia to elevate these sorts of views. So one of them actually contributed a great deal of money to set up a think tank at University of Technology, Sydney, that partnered with a number of really important Western corporations, you know, who were very generally pro-trade towards China. Another one of them bet $800 million a year in a casino in Melbourne as part of his business running junkets from China through Australia, and that, you know, money from this was spread into local organizations as well as ways of boosting the profile of these men and their views. And it all kind of came to a head when an Australian Labor senator got up at a press conference for Chinese language media in Australia and more or less repeated Beijing's line on the South China Sea, saying that the South China Sea is China's territory. Australia does not have compelling security interests in this, and it would be in our interest if we just butt it out. And I think that was kind of the moment where it unleashed, it prompted a lot of sort of, how did we arrive at this? And the Australian government commissioned a thoroughgoing review of China policy, a lot of which is still classified. But the government at the time, the Turnbull government, ended up proposing a suite of laws that were meant to address some of these issues they found. Obviously, they banned donations by non-Australian citizens to campaigns. That's not a problem in Europe. You know, most European countries don't allow that sort of thing. They also changed some of the laws around lobbying in Australia. There was a whole suite of regulations that were put in place that I frankly would recommend anybody in this room who wants to know about this to go study. There was a large review of how the Australian university sector relates to China. It's a big deal in Australia because they have only 8 major universities, and all of them have a lot of students from China that provide a large portion of their tuition and operating budgets. And so when the Chinese ambassador sort of hints that the flow of students might dry up, those very politically powerful universities take that threat very seriously. So I would sort of encourage people in this room to have a look at some of the steps that Australia has taken. But in the European context, I would also encourage people to have a look at European lobbying laws, which are something of a patchwork across the continent, not only at the national level, but at the supranational level in the EU. Different countries have very, very different laws, and even the laws at the EU level are not, frankly, at the level of what we have in the United States in terms of requiring transparency and disclosure about who is meeting with what's the term, EMPs? For a European member of parliament? MEPs, thank you. Who is meeting with what EMPs, what they're talking about, what the interests of the people meeting with them are. And we've heard discussions about people hiring media firms, people hiring lobbying firms. American companies do this as well, just like Huawei does. But I think the point is that the people of Europe deserve to know, regardless of whether it's American Chinese, they deserve to know who is talking with their elected officials about what. And so that's probably the main thing I would encourage people here to look at.
Great. 2 recommendations. Let's look at Australia and also tighten up lobby laws. Didi? Recommendations for policymakers on the national level?
Yeah, so taking again the German example, because it's a pretty big one in Europe, I think that, you know, Germany's a very decentralized society. One could even call it fragmented in a way. The localities in the states have great power. And it's extremely porous, as we've seen, the 88 sister city relationships that exist in Germany between German cities in China, or German communes or municipalities in China, including 4 for the town of Wolfsburg alone. Wolfsburg is the headquarters of Volkswagen. Wolfsburg is sister city relationships with 4 locations in China. So it's extremely porous, and what we really need, first of all, is a coordination mechanism so that localities can connect to the national government, ask for expertise, ask for advice, ask for analysis, check mutually what's going on, who are they being approached by. As Matt says, the need to get more granular about who exactly you're dealing with. What are the interests involved here? Again, this then connects to the second point, which is we simply need a lot more expertise. I would echo Matt's point again. Anyone thinking of funding anything in Europe these days, please fund knowledge about China. And it cannot be done just in Brussels, although they have come up with a bit of money now. For the first time ever, by the way. It's not enough to do it through Brussels. We need to do it at the nation-state level as well. We need far more granular analysis. Third point, very briefly, on what to actually do. Transparency. Again, it is transparency. It's about our transparency, about us sticking to good practices of governance, of clean governance. The case I mentioned in Mannheim of the Bundestag member who was paid €250,000 to distribute masks at the depths of the terrible times in the pandemic last year. He did lose his Bundestag seat because he was seen as profiteering from a pandemic, but he got to keep the money. The Bundesverwaltungshof in Leipzig decided that somehow he could keep the money. So, you know, at the end of the day, you walk away with €250,000. That's not bad for a contact. Or why do people get into politics? They can make deals like that, right? So, no offense, but it does seem to be. I mean, the money also drives the China side. That's very clear to a degree that we probably underestimate. You know,
that's why some people get into politics.
Yes, no. I mean, I have great respect for politicians. I don't know how you do it, putting yourself out there all the time, but definitely we do see some problems popping up in that regard.
So we have Czech elections coming up soon. You're a member of the Pirate Party. Should your party find itself in the ruling coalition or ruling government, what's the policy which we might expect to see out of Czechia?
Yes, well, I'm not exactly on a candidate list in this national election, so maybe I will maybe try to connect this with the previous topic here, should the mayors rule the world? And I will talk about the municipal perspective of this. So, well, if you would like to, if you, for example, hear promises of Chinese investments, or if you think about having a Chinese, a mainland China partner in, for example, an IT project or whatever project actually, you should think twice. Look at the example from Prague and think twice if you wish to have such a partner that in a case you will do anything like basically criticizing his action from the value point of view. For example, from my point of view is generally not, if you are running concentration camp for ethnic minorities, you're definitely not part of a civilized society. So if you do this, look carefully what if you would like to have a partner that would do these things, what they did to Prague. For example, would you like to have a partner in a technological project, for example, having his devices in your critical network that you use for coordinating firefighters or ambulances in the city? Would you like to have a partner like this who would, for example, turn your network off in case you would say something what he would not like. So that's the first thing, what you have to think about if you hear pledges for economical investments or whatever. You should think twice if there is not maybe a better partner for such a project. By the way, if we compare the investments from the mainland China and Taiwan into Czech Republic, actually Taiwan wins even on absolute numbers. And I'm not talking if you would put the number of people in the countries into the formula and you would like compare the size of the countries as well. So maybe you should think twice where would you like to even assess the risks, if you want to assess the risks, because it is really a complicated way. So first think twice if it's worth to undergo that way. So that's the first thing. And the second thing, if you in the end decide that it is worth the price, you definitely should stand on your values, and definitely you should not sell your soul for the economical benefits, which maybe will not ever come, by the way.
Wonderful. Dr. Filipova?
I would like to stress the role of business in terms of countering the influx of Chinese corrosive capital and the ability to attract constructive capital. Because on the political level, I think in Southeast Europe, the process of democratization is ongoing, and the major challenge is to really confront and deal with state capture networks. But I think that in the meantime, what business does is very important. And here are a few points. So first of all, in the case of Bulgaria, Romania, and other Balkan countries, I think it is of critical importance to continue to develop a culture of entrepreneurship, because I think the low levels of entrepreneurship in those countries is still a path-dependent legacy of the communist period. And the entrepreneurial businesses that do exist, that they do have a responsibility also to younger and upcoming generations of business entrepreneurs to socialize them in certain values of social responsibility, transparency, self-reliance, as opposed to the business practices that come from authoritarian states and that can penetrate a given country. For example, corruption and dependence on state support that usually come with Chinese investment flows. Also, the second point is about the importance of businesses to continue to build their innovation capacity, because I think this is a primary way for the Bulgarian economy and also other economies in the region to become high value added, and for those businesses to participate in cross EU innovative networks that can in turn compete against China and its growing technological edge. I think that also, thirdly, businesses should strive for an enhanced social impact and continue to sustainable community development and implement various projects, including infrastructural ones, so that they're of benefit to local populations, and this in turn would obviate the need and demand for China-sponsored infrastructure projects in the region. And last but not least, civil society should of course be included as a partner to businesses, to various businesses, in terms of overseeing, scrutinizing the investment flows that come from authoritarian states, in terms of, for instance, putting to scrutiny the various deals and pledges that are put forward by countries such as China, and at the same time championing exemplary businesses.
Wonderful. I would like to thank everybody for coming and joining our panel today. Please give a large round of applause for our panelists. And as I hand the mic over back to the organizers, I would like to draw attention to one thing and present and ask to everyone in the audience. You're probably all very aware of the pressure that Lithuania has been under recently for its desire to establish closer relationships with Taiwan, for its recognition of the importance of human rights, and decisions have been, things have been discussed in the parliament. If you have a moment when you're sitting here today, you're on Twitter, please put that support out there. You know, our countries, as we ask for countries to be able to stand up to authoritarianism, we also need to support them in the process. And a good example of this is a statement from the Slovenian Democratic Party yesterday, Mr. Jansa. So I encourage everyone to have a look at this, and please do tweet out your support for Lithuania. Thank you very much, and pleasure to be here. It's all yours.